The early morning of June 22, 1941, marked the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. The German Wehrmacht unleashed a massive, lightning-fast attack across the entire front line, aiming to quickly overwhelm the entire Soviet army. The core strategy of the German advance was Blitzkrieg, lightning war, which demanded the complete destruction of all forward defenses and the rapid advance of armored divisions, leaving no fortified enemy pockets behind to disrupt supply lines. The entire operation was predicated on crushing the Soviet resistance before winter could set in. The immense initial weight of this German offensive fell directly upon the Brest Fortress, located strategically right on the German-Soviet border in what is now Belarus. This sprawling, 19th-century fortress complex was highly visible, located directly along the main communication routes the German Wehrmacht needed for their advance eastward. The German High Command considered the fortress a minor, fixed obstacle. Their operational orders were clear: secure the entire complex and eliminate all Soviet army resistance within the first few hours of the invasion, certainly before noon on the first day. The garrison caught inside the Brest Fortress was severely ill-prepared for the sudden, massive scale of the attack. The fortress held a mixed force of approximately 8,000 Soviet soldiers, composed of various infantry, border guard units, and administrative personnel. Crucially, most of the garrison was asleep or in the process of routine morning duties when the assault began. Their units were scattered across the wide complex, lacking coordinated leadership and a clear defensive plan for a full-scale German attack, leaving them highly vulnerable to a concentrated, surprise assault. At 4:15 a.m., the first German artillery shells struck the fortress, unleashing a devastating, sudden barrage that shattered the early morning silence. The initial concentrated fire caused immense casualties and destroyed communication lines instantly. Following the artillery, the German Wehrmacht infantry launched a massive, coordinated assault, quickly seizing large sections of the unorganized perimeter. The attackers, confident in their numerical superiority and the surprise achieved, were convinced that the Brest Fortress, and its surviving Soviet army defenders, would fall within the next few hours. The initial German Wehrmacht assault on the Brest Fortress achieved near-total surprise, plunging the entire complex into immediate chaos. The devastating artillery barrage destroyed command posts, collapsed barracks, and severed all internal and external communication lines, leaving the surviving Soviet army units isolated and leaderless. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in the first hours. The disoriented defenders, many still in their underwear, were forced to fight from whatever cover they could find, using the massive medieval walls and shattered buildings as their only protection against the advancing German infantry. Despite the near-catastrophic initial damage and the loss of formal command, pockets of fierce Soviet army resistance quickly solidified. Instead of collapsing under the hammer blow, disparate groups of soldiers, often under the command of junior officers or even non-commissioned officers, spontaneously organized themselves into tenacious defensive strongholds. They utilized the deep, stone bunkers and the fortress's numerous casemates as individual fortresses, fighting with whatever rifles, machine guns, and grenades they could salvage from the chaos, refusing the expected immediate surrender. The central defense crystallized around the main island of the fortress, known as the Citadel. Here, thousands of surviving Soviet army soldiers, along with hundreds of military dependents who were also trapped inside, consolidated their position. They barricaded gates, organized firing points, and began a desperate, coordinated defense, realizing they were completely surrounded. Among the emerging leaders was Major Pyotr Gavrilov, who would become one of the most famous figures of the siege, commanding a determined resistance from the eastern sector of the fortress. The initial German Wehrmacht plan to take the fortress within hours failed completely. By the end of June 22, 1941, the German forces had managed to capture most of the outer perimeter, but they had not secured the key central strongholds. They were forced into a prolonged, costly siege against tenacious Soviet army defenders whose fierce resistance was tying down entire German infantry regiments. The German High Command was quickly learning that what they anticipated would be a simple, early morning cleanup operation had instead turned into a desperate, brutal, and unforeseen struggle. As the siege of Brest Fortress deepened, the German Wehrmacht quickly adapted its tactics, realizing that a direct frontal assault would be too costly. Instead, they focused on breaking the Soviet army defenders through attrition and psychological warfare. One of their most effective and brutal strategies was to systematically cut off the fortress's water supply. The main water main was quickly destroyed in the initial bombardment, forcing the hundreds of trapped soldiers and civilians to rely on a few remaining, contaminated wells or desperate forays to the river under constant German fire. The desperate search for water became the primary driver of survival inside the besieged fortress. The summer heat of June 1941 was relentless, and thirst quickly became a more immediate threat than German bullets. Groups of Soviet army soldiers, often under the cover of darkness, would attempt to reach the Mukovets River, which flowed through the fortress complex. These missions were incredibly perilous, as German Wehrmacht machine gunners maintained continuous fire on any movement near the riverbanks, turning every trip for water into a potential suicide mission. The suffering inside the fortress was immense. Wounded soldiers, with no medical supplies and no access to clean water, quickly succumbed to infection and dehydration. The hundreds of women and children trapped alongside the soldiers faced unimaginable horrors, enduring the constant shelling, the lack of food, and the agonizing thirst. The Soviet army defenders, even as their numbers dwindled and their bodies weakened, continued to fight with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that surrender would likely mean death or brutal captivity. The German Wehrmacht continued its relentless assault, using flamethrowers to clear out bunkers, dropping heavy bombs, and even attempting to flood sections of the fortress. Yet, the Soviet army defenders refused to yield. Messages scrawled on the walls by the dying soldiers attested to their unshakable resolve. "I'm dying, but I won't surrender. Farewell, motherland." This unwavering spirit, even as their fate was sealed by the rapidly advancing German front, transformed the Brest Fortress into an enduring symbol of Soviet resistance against the overwhelming might of Operation Barbarossa. As days turned into weeks, the German Wehrmacht grew increasingly frustrated by the tenacious, unexpected resistance of the Soviet army garrison in the Brest Fortress. The delay was unacceptable for the Blitzkrieg schedule, which demanded rapid advances and minimal diversions. Unable to dislodge the defenders with conventional infantry assaults, the German High Command escalated their tactics, bringing to bear some of their most destructive siege weapons to systematically eliminate the stubborn pockets of resistance. The German Wehrmacht deployed specialized engineering units equipped with devastating flamethrowers. These units systematically targeted the fortress's numerous casemates, underground bunkers, and fortified positions, spraying torrents of burning fuel into the dark, enclosed spaces. The intense heat and choking smoke forced many Soviet army defenders to either evacuate their positions, exposing them to waiting German machine guns, or to burn alive in the inferno, turning the claustrophobic tunnels into fiery death traps. In addition to the flamethrowers, the German Wehrmacht unleashed relentless aerial bombardments. Heavy bombs, some weighing up to 1,800 kilograms, were dropped directly onto the fortress, aiming to collapse entire sections of the ancient walls and underground shelters. These massive explosions caused widespread structural damage, sealed off escape routes, and buried hundreds of Soviet army soldiers alive, adding to the immense suffering and physical destruction of the already devastated complex. The air attacks were designed to shatter both morale and remaining resistance. Despite this overwhelming display of destructive power, the remaining Soviet army defenders of the Brest Fortress continued their desperate resistance. Isolated pockets of soldiers, often severely wounded and starved, fought from the rubble and the deepest underground chambers. Their supplies of ammunition were dwindling, and their numbers were drastically reduced, but their will to fight remained unbroken. This extraordinary defiance forced the German Wehrmacht to commit an entire division to the siege, a costly diversion from their main advance, proving the strategic significance of the Soviet army garrison stand. By the end of the first week of Operation Barbarossa, the organized resistance within the Brest Fortress had largely collapsed, transitioning into desperate, localized fighting among small groups of survivors. The constant German Wehrmacht use of heavy artillery, aerial bombs, and flamethrowers had rendered the main barracks and communication centers into uninhabitable rubble. The focus of the defense fractured into a few isolated, tenacious pockets, primarily concentrated in the core citadel and the heavily fortified eastern fort, where the last remaining coordinated Soviet army units desperately fought to maintain their positions. The strongholds were systematically eliminated. The eastern fort, which held out with particular stubbornness, became a major target for the German besiegers. Unable to breach the fort's thick walls with conventional artillery, the German High Command ordered a massive aerial assault. A colossal 1,800-kilogram bomb was dropped directly onto the structure, collapsing large sections of the fort and forcing the final remaining defenders, who were sheltering many of the fortress's women and children, to finally surrender. The fall of this key stronghold marked the tragic end of one of the largest pockets of unified resistance. Despite the surrender of the eastern fort, a few core strongholds deep within the central citadel continued to defy the siege, surviving in the fortress's deepest casemates and bunkers. The persistence of this resistance, months after the German front had already swept hundreds of miles eastward toward Minsk and Smolensk, was an immense strategic embarrassment to the German Wehrmacht. The German command was forced to call back heavy artillery and specialized engineering units, resources urgently needed elsewhere, highlighting the massive, unforeseen cost of the fortress garrison's tenacity. The German Wehrmacht turned heavily to psychological warfare to break the final defenders. Using large loudspeaker systems, they played triumphant military music and broadcast constant propaganda, promising the remaining Soviet army soldiers good treatment, food, and water if they would only surrender. However, the last remaining defenders, knowing the grim fate of many Soviet prisoners, refused to yield, choosing instead to fight from the dark, rubble-choked bunkers until their last reserves of ammunition and water were gone, forcing the Germans to continue the costly, direct assaults against the rubble. By the second week of July 1941, the fighting at the Brest Fortress had devolved into a grim battle of extermination. The German Wehrmacht officially claimed control, but hidden deep within the rubble and the collapsed casemates of the citadel, and the Kolmsky Gate, small, isolated pockets of Soviet army soldiers continued to defy the siege. These final holdouts, often numbering just 1 or 2 men, were fighting solely for survival and pride. They were utterly surrounded by the enemy and had no food, water, or fresh ammunition, yet their continued resistance was a constant, infuriating strategic embarrassment for the German advance. The face of this final, desperate resistance was Major Pyotr Gavrilov. Weeks after the German Wehrmacht had claimed total victory, Gavrilov continued to fight alone from the deepest casemates of the eastern fort. He was finally captured on July 23, 1941, nearly 1 full month after the invasion began. The German soldiers who captured him were shocked. They found the major severely wounded, weakened by starvation and thirst, but he had fought to the very last bullet. Gavrilov's unwavering defiance forced the German command to officially recognize the persistence and singular courage of the individual Soviet army soldier. Even following the high-profile capture of Major Pyotr Gavrilov, resistance inside the Brest Fortress was not immediately extinguished. Pockets of completely isolated Soviet army soldiers, having no knowledge that their commanders had surrendered or that the entire front line had shifted hundreds of miles to the east, continued to fight from the deepest underground chambers. The sound of sporadic gunfire could be heard throughout the ruins until at least August 1941, forcing the German Wehrmacht to maintain a security presence where their main forces should have already advanced. The immense frustration of the German Wehrmacht was captured in their own internal reports, which noted the unbelievable tenacity of the last defenders. When the Germans finally managed to clear the deepest bunkers, they found messages scrawled onto the shattered walls by the dying Soviet army soldiers, affirming their spiritual victory over the overwhelming mechanical force. These defiant messages, such as the famous inscription, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland," transformed the Brest Fortress into an enduring symbol of Soviet resistance against the overwhelming might of Operation Barbarossa. The final elimination of the resistance proved to be a costly and time-consuming process for the German Wehrmacht. Unable to effectively engage the last isolated pockets of Soviet Army soldiers hidden deep in the collapsed casemates, the German command resorted to extreme engineering tactics. They systematically pumped water into the underground chambers and used powerful explosives to seal off entire sections of the fortress, effectively entombing the remaining defenders alive. This brutal, calculated tactic was a direct acknowledgement that the German Wehrmacht was unwilling to risk any more infantry casualties in close quarters fighting against the hopelessly defiant garrison. The immense human cost of the siege extended far beyond the soldiers. Hundreds of women and children, the military dependents of the Soviet Army officers, were trapped inside the Brest Fortress from the very beginning. They endured the relentless shelling, the fire, the thirst, and the agonizing heat alongside the fighters. Though many were eventually released by the German Wehrmacht when their defensive pockets collapsed, others were tragically killed during the intense fighting or were later sent to concentration camps, adding a devastating and often overlooked layer to the total sacrifice of the siege. The true story of the defense was immediately suppressed by both sides for very different reasons. The German Wehrmacht classified the full extent of the siege's delay and the cost in manpower, fearing it would damage the image of their invincible Blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, the Soviet government initially suppressed the full story, as the narrative of widespread early surrender or capture of soldiers did not fit the official message of total patriotic unity. The heroic sacrifice of the garrison remained largely unknown for over a decade after World War II, obscured by political expediency and military censorship. Despite the final defeat and the tragic loss of life, the small garrison achieved a massive, unforeseen strategic victory. The fierce, unexpected defense tied down the entire 45th German Infantry Division for nearly a month, crippling the initial advance of a major German Wehrmacht offensive that was supposed to secure the entire region within hours. The time gained, measured in days and weeks, proved invaluable to the Soviet Army's subsequent efforts to mobilize and organize their deeper defenses, transforming the defense of the Brest Fortress into an integral part of the narrative of Soviet resilience. For more than a decade after World War II, the full, tragic story of the Brest Fortress remained largely unknown, obscured by political secrecy and the rapid changes in the post-war Soviet Union. It was not until the mid-1950s that the first official investigations and archaeological excavations brought the full scale of the heroism to light. The discovery of the defiant messages scrawled onto the ruins, such as the famous final inscription, "I am dying, but I will not surrender," provided irrefutable proof of the long, dedicated resistance, contradicting the initial military narrative of swift collapse. This rediscovery of the truth led to immediate and massive national recognition. The Soviet Union officially bestowed the title of Hero Fortress upon the Brest Fortress, an honor reserved for the most valiantly defended cities and sites. Survivors, including Major Pyotr Gavrilov, who had endured years in German prisoner of war camps and later faced internal suspicion upon his return, were finally recognized, rehabilitated, and eventually awarded the highest honor, Hero of the Soviet Union. Their personal suffering and silent heroism were finally acknowledged by the nation they had fought for. To honor the defenders' extraordinary sacrifice, the vast Brest Fortress Hero Memorial Complex was constructed in the 1960s and 1970s. This massive memorial, featuring towering monuments, ruins preserved as historical relics, and eternal flames, became one of the most significant and visited war memorials in Europe. The complex stands as a permanent tribute to the tenacity of the garrison and the multinational composition of the soldiers who had fought and died together against the German Wehrmacht. The defense of the Brest Fortress remains a profound and solemn symbol of the immense human cost and the unwavering resilience that characterized the initial phase of the war on the Eastern Front. Though the fortress fell, the garrison's unexpected, fierce resistance served as a chilling omen for the German Wehrmacht. Their defiant stand permanently disrupted the German timetable and proved that the Soviet army, even when completely surrounded and outgunned, possessed an unyielding will to fight for its land, setting the stage for the longer, darker battles to come.